All right, this is the third video for this particular chapter. It's a bit lengthy for this particular chapter. So let us finish off our discussion on internal analysis. So the next part that we are going to discuss is on the value chain analysis. Value chain analysis refers to the process whereby a firms determine the costs associated with organizational activities from purchasing raw materials to manufacturing products to marketing those products. Aims to identify where low cost advantages or disadvantages exist anywhere along the value chain for raw material to customer service activities. So organization, they are doing this, the value chain analysis. They need to identify, if you were to develop, to identify which of the resources, which of the activity within your organization that could be developed as your distinctive competency, that's something that cannot be matched or imitated by your competitors. What you need to do is you need to do this value chain analysis. You need to list down each of the activities from the purchasing, from the arrival of the materials, from the purchasing, the arrival of materials, and then we go into the mixing, weighing, mixing, baking, and then packaging, and then delivering, distribution. So if we talk about the functions of a bakery, so you need to identify all of those activities, and then you need to identify the costs associated with those activities. So from that value chain, then only you can identify in terms of where do you have this low cost advantage or disadvantage as compared to your competitors. So if you have identified your low cost advantage, maybe this is something that you need to protect. This is something that you need to focus and develop. And if you identify in terms of low cost disadvantage, maybe you need to decide whether you want to remain that particular activity within your organization, or whether you want to outsource that particular activity to external consultant or constituents in order to deliver that particular function for your organization. So it's a big decision that needs to be made based from this value chain analysis. So I have identified in terms of one example of a value chain so that you can have a much better picture in terms of what does a value chain look like. So this is a example of a value chain. So you have the primary activities, supply chain, operation, distribution, sales and marketing, and then the support activities, and the detail of the activities can be looked into your figure 6.7 in from your textbook, in which you can identify each of the costs associated with each of the function. So if you are able to do this, when the organization is able to do this, they can identify the potential low cost advantage that they possess, and as well as they can identify the cost disadvantage that they have as compared to the competitors. So that is the only way for the organization to develop or identify their distinctive competency. So if they are able to do this, through the value chain, it would help the organization to identify their their expert area within their production, within their activities, as compared to the area that needs to be developed or improved in order for them to develop their sustainable competitive advantage. So how does the value chain activities contribute to the sustainable competitive advantage? So after you have identified your value chain, after you have identified and assessed, so maybe you can identify that there are core competency that arise in some of those activities. And then some of those core competency could be evolved into your distinctive competency, and this distinctive competency could be evolved into your sustainable competitive advantage. For example, when we talk about Panama, no, coffee bean, in which they own the whole farm in Panama. So that resources is considered as part of their value chain activities that has been assessed and analyzed. So what is their core competency is in terms of the resources. They own a high quality and standard level of resources. And that core competency, by owning that the whole farm in Panama, so that could be developed into their distinctive competency, because their competitors cannot match in terms of the availability of the resources and the standard quality of the resources that they have. and then that element could become their sustainable competitive advantage. For some of other organization, maybe perhaps they have a tracking system, the whole fleet for the organization. So their value chain, the activities they identified and assessed, they identified that they have the tracking system, the distribution, and then that is considered as their core competency. And then this could help into the development of their sustainable competitive advantage in terms of the distribution part, in which they can go and distribute into throughout the country. So that core competency, the fleet, the transportation could be developed into their distinctive competency. They can go into every channel of distribution that exists within the organization, and then by having that sustainable competitive advantage is one of their core elements lah. For example, like Starbucks, no, 7-Eleven, and they have many 7-Elevens all around the country, and then they have their own distribution, they have their own tracking system, their lorries, and then that could be developed into their sustainable competitive advantage. So how can organization develop their improve from their value chain analysis? One of the element that they can do is through benchmarking. Benchmarking would allow the firm to evaluate their value chain activities and to identify, assess whether or not their value chain activities are competitive as compared to the rivals. And then you can entail measuring costs of value chain activities across an industry to determine the best practices. So you can learn from others, their best practices to identify the ways in order for you to minimize your cost for it for your activities. And then we have talked about this, the IFE metrics. So I'm just going to wrap up briefly on this. This is the same, pretty much the same metrics as EFE that we have already discussed in the previous chapter. It is just that the difference between the IFE and EFE is that if you look at the rating can only be used for the strength 3 and 4. 4 for major strengths, and then 3 for minor strength. And then for weaknesses, we are only going to rate 1 and 2 only. 1 for major weaknesses and 2 for minor weaknesses. So you still need to do the same thing, identify the strength and weaknesses. If possible, you arrange this according to the weight, so it is much more easier for you to put on the weight. And then make sure that when you add all of the weights, it will bring down to 1.00. And then you put on the rating 3 and 4 for the strengths, and then 1 and 2 for the weaknesses, and then you multiply the weight and the rating, and this will give you the total weighted score for the IFE matrix. So that would be the end of the lecture for this particular chapter. So after this, I would expect that each and every group would prepare their own SWOT analysis, and then maybe you can start to play around with the IFE as well as the EFE. And I will actually, yes, I will ask each of the group to present the finding on the IFE and EFE metrics as we go along, inshallah, starting from next week, inshallah. All right, so please take care of yourself. Have a good day, and assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.